Welcome everyone to another episode of Pop Rant Radio, the podcast where normally two pop culture junkies discuss popular and sometimes not so popular culture. My name is Moss, I'm one of your hosts, and today I'll be your only host because Eric and I just couldn't find the time to get together this week. We're both working full time now, so things just didn't happen this week. So this week you're stuck with me and just me, so hopefully you enjoy it. I'm going to talk about something that's important to me in fiction, movies, television, novels, video games, that sort of thing, and that is magic. Now, I've talked about the magic of movie making before. It's a concept that I'm a really big fan of, specifically in reference to a lot of movies from my childhood, a lot of movies that came out in the 80s and in the early 90s when I was growing up, and really when I was being influenced by what I call the magic of movie making. And the best way I can describe that, I know I've tried to do so before, but think about a movie like Back to the Future Part 1, where it's just this coming together of all the ideas that are represented in a piece of fiction. You know, we have the time travel plot, but it really goes into who Marty McFly is as a character and the reuniting of his parents and the ignition of their relationship and how it changes from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie, where the relationship is very, very different. They have a more loving relationship, and we see how that kind of trickles down into their lives as a family after that. That movie has a lot of elements going on. It's very enriched with comedy and action and the time period that it's in. It's just steeped in detail. It has wonderful, memorable portrayals by Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd. It's really a hard movie to beat as far as just the quality that period of time really represented when it comes to movie making. And that's really what I mean by movie magic, is it's a coming together of all of these different facets and all of these different elements when it comes to a story and storytelling to really produce something, for lack of a better term, magical. And Back to the Future, Star Wars, A New Hope, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ghostbusters, there's all these movies, and there's many, many more that really fit this criteria. And this is a little biased because, you know, this is the time where I grew up, and this was the time that movies were influencing me so very greatly. But that's when it was happening. It's this late 80s, early 90s era of just these fantastic movies. You know, you have E.T. a few years earlier, 1982, for Steven Spielberg. Just all of these movies that really shaped the consciousness and a generation of film watchers and filmmakers, which we're still seeing the repercussions of today. That was a huge influence on me when I was a kid, and even till this day, of what I appreciate in movies and in storytelling in general. So that's my concept of the magic of movies, but that's actually not what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about the concept of magic. You know, whether it's wizards and spells and lightning bolts and fireballs, it's something that's been portrayed many, many times in a lot of different media. But specifically today, I'm going to talk about the instances that really influenced me when I was young and kind of shaped my idea of what magic in fiction is and kind of how that applies to storytelling in general. So the first example that we're going to use is a movie that I've talked about before on a previous episode of the podcast, and that is The Sword and the Stone, the Disney movie from 1963. Huge, absolutely huge influence on me when I was a kid. Watched it over and over and over again. The legend of King Arthur and Merlin and Camelot. And obviously the Disney take on this is a very watered down version of tales like Le Morte d'Arthur and other adaptations that are prevalent throughout all of literature and adaptation in general. But the Disney movie was hugely influential on me. And the representation of magic in this movie is pretty fantastic because it all revolves around Merlin teaching Arthur the idea that although magic is useful and magic has all of these wonderful properties, magic can't solve all the world's problems.
No, well, don't you get any foolish ideas that magic will solve all your problems, because it won't.
Hey, don't go around thinking magic can solve all of your problems, because it won't. Like, you have to get an education. And the entire crux of this movie is Merlin using magic, whether it's transforming into different creatures or battling against an evil witch, teaching Arthur that his higher education is really the most, pardon the metaphor, magical thing that can happen. The higher education really leads him to become a great leader and a great man. Well, at least in the context of this Disney movie. Merlin is using magic as a lesson to teach Arthur it's not about being the biggest and the strongest. It's about using your intellect, using your knowledge, using your cleverness to overcome problems. And this is exemplified in a particular scene where Merlin transforms Arthur into a fish and himself into a fish, and they both jump into the moat surrounding Sir Ector's castle. When they go inside, there's this gigantic, like shark-like fish that ends up chasing after them. And Arthur has to use his knowledge and his brains to overcome this bigger fish. The bigger fish clearly has the upper hand on him as far as strength, and Merlin tells him, now's the chance to prove my point. You know, he's the brawn, you're the brains. And Arthur picks up a broken arrow from the bottom of the moat and uses it to open the jaws of the huge beast and defeat it by using his brains, using his cleverness. And this is a motif that's echoed throughout the entire film. Arthur has to constantly use the lessons that Merlin is teaching him in order to overcome his problems. And again, exemplified with Arthur's adoptive brother, Sir Kay, who's this big, brawny, kind of dumb guy. But Arthur looks up to Kay. From the very beginning of the movie, you can tell that Arthur really exalts Kay and his abilities and his strength and his brawn. But we can tell very quickly that Kay's kind of an idiot. And throughout the whole course of the movie, Merlin is teaching Arthur that's not necessarily what you want to be doing. Like, you can receive in higher education. You can learn to read and write. And throughout the course of the film, Arthur really does realize knowledge and education is the true power. That culminates at the very end of the film where Arthur is sitting on the throne, not knowing what to do because he is this boy king who's been thrust into leadership, and really he has no idea what he's doing. They just made him king because he pulled the sword out of the stone. And Merlin shows up at the very end after having abandoned him earlier in the movie because Arthur ultimately decides he's going to be Kay's squire and go to this tournament. Merlin is disappointed because he's kind of thrown away all the lessons that he's learned throughout the film, and Merlin takes off. So he comes back at the very end of the movie. Arthur basically laments like, Merlin, you were right. I'm so glad to have you here. And Merlin says, don't worry, things are going to be okay. You're going to be a great king. And they start kind of discussing what they're going to do going forward. And that's the end of the movie. And again, the movie just really exemplifies the idea that the higher education and the knowledge is really what's going to make Arthur succeed. And they use magic throughout the storytelling to really get that message across. Magic is used as an educational tool so it can further the ideas of what Arthur is ultimately going to do. And this, I think, was a really big influence on me because it kind of cements the idea that magic is an extension of knowledge. Magic is an extension of higher education. Magic is not something that defies logic, defies rationale, but it acts within the boundaries of logic and rationale. It's merely an extension of those concepts. And that's something I think that kind of repeats throughout my childhood and my understanding of magic in other movies and TV shows and video games, which we're going to get into. But the idea that magic is really just an extension of logic and reason. So the next example I want to talk about is from a 1998 miniseries starring Sam Neill called Merlin, and it's also about the famous wizard, but it tells a very, very different version of the story. And this was a TV miniseries, like I said, from 1998. I want to say it aired on NBC, maybe. It was national television. We only had antenna television in my house. We didn't have cable or satellite or anything like that when I was growing up. The whole idea behind this story is it tells the origin of Merlin the wizard, as played by Sam Neill, known very well from his role in Jurassic Park, and to a lesser extent, Red October, and even Damien in the third Omen movie. He was really good in that. That's not a good movie, but he's good in it. The idea here is that Merlin is kind of in the middle of this war of ideas. At the beginning of the movie, it's established that Queen Mab, who is this kind of goddess, higher being, sorceress woman, she's kind of like, I guess, a demigod and of a pagan faith. It's not really explicitly spelled out. But throughout the course of the movie, Uther Pendragon, who you may know as King Arthur's father from all of the legends surrounding Arthur and Camelot. He is a champion of Christianity, as was his father, whose name I don't remember right now, but it's not important. So the idea behind this miniseries is that the old pagan ways are going out of style. They are losing ground. And there's an idea that this series establishes that the gods are only as powerful as the number of believers that still trust in them. And this is a concept that's been used fairly often in fiction, like even down to video games. Like I think there's some real-time strategy games that even borrow from this idea that gods are only as powerful as the people who believe in them. Even Patton Oswalt has a line in one of his stand-up comedy recordings where he talks about this like ancient trickster god who someone remembers like one day and he gets an ounce of power and it lets him do like one little prank.
I feel like doing research. Is there a forgotten Sumerian prankster god and his feast day is July 3rd? He's got one worshiper left, and the dude killed a goat over a copper bowl, and it gave the prankster god 40 seconds of power in our realm. He just poofed into being and went, "Did someone in Burbank just say there's no rats? Well, beans and grapes, what jokes and japes I'll play. I need a telephone line, a hawk, and the biggest rat you've ever seen."
But the idea here is that the gods only have as much power as the people that believe in them. The people that believe in these gods are the ones that give them their power. That actual belief system is what fuels their ability to do godlike things. And this is ever present throughout this miniseries. So at the beginning of the story, Queen Mab, who's of this pagan idea, she realizes that eventually people are going to forget about her and forget about the ancient gods and the ancient beings. And she wants to do something about it. So she decides that she is going to create a champion, an avatar that's going to go forth into the world and restore the ideas of the quote unquote old ways. That avatar ends up being Merlin. She creates Merlin in this like red crystal in her lair, and when she breaks it apart, Merlin is born as a child in the real world. Very Anakin Skywalker with the midichlorians conceiving and there being no father, kind of along the same lines, but a year earlier than that movie. So Merlin is born, and his mother immediately dies, and he is raised by a woman named Ambrosia, again going along with the legends that generally follow with Merlin and Arthur and Camelot and all these things. When he reaches adulthood, he is contacted and taken by Queen Mab, and Queen Mab, along with her assistant Frick, played by Martin Short as a tall gnome, he's great, they are attempting to teach him all about magic. And in this world, there are 3 different types of wizards that can perform 3 different types of magic. And the first is known as spoken wizards or spoken magic. Wizards that actually have to say particular magic words in order to convey certain ideas, in order to cast certain spells or manipulate the world in a certain way. The second level is hand wizards or hand magic, where you move beyond the idea that you have to speak words, but certain gestures with your hands, again, kind of bend reality and make spells and make magic happen. And then the third level is a thought wizard who can control magic and alter reality with just mere thought. The interesting thing about this movie talks about how Merlin is the most famous and most powerful wizard of all time, but Merlin himself never moves beyond being a hand wizard, the second level, because, as explained in the movie, his heart's just not in it. He doesn't love magic. In fact, he ends up growing to kind of despise magic because Mab wants him to use magic in order to convert people back to the old ways, in order to rule people once again. And Merlin rejects this idea, so he ultimately abandons Mab and vows to not use magic unless it is in the service of defeating Mab. And of course, throughout the story, he has to break this vow for several different reasons, because that's the nature of storytelling and that's the nature of drama, but it ends up working out. And this miniseries isn't flawless by any stretch of the imagination. It has some like tone fluctuations going all over the place. There's some very like late 20th century humor kind of injected in this medieval drama that doesn't really play. It's kind of funny and it's kind of cheesy in a very like mid 90s sort of way, but it's charming nonetheless. So again, we have the idea that magic is really just an extension of the wizard's ability to kind of have knowledge about how to manipulate the world. Magic isn't so much there to completely break the rules and alter reality's foundations. It's there to assist in the wizard's ability to kind of shift things, but still play within the rules. There's not a lot of magic that's actually shown in the movie in comparison to other works of fiction, but all the magic that is there is kind of, again, shown to shift reality because nobody overtly goes over the top with anything. There's a lot of instances of children being born and that child growing up to overtake their father. It comes with Arthur and Uther Pendragon, and it also comes with Mordred, who in this version is Arthur's son and ends up being the traitor to his entire kingdom. And the idea is that magic is used to enhance the enmity and the hateful feelings that the son has for the father in the case of Mordred and Arthur, and that the magic is there to kind of enhance that idea, enhance the feelings that are already there, to use magic in order to propel Mordred to go up against Arthur and ultimately attempt to take over the kingdom of Camelot. There isn't lightning bolts and fireballs being rained down on Arthur and killing him. Magic is used to kind of supplement the story and the plot, to supplement the ideas and the motifs of the characters and the themes that are going on within the story. And the other thing that magic is doing in this is magic is really an engine in order for the gods to perpetuate their own ideas, perpetuate their own existence. Mab in this story doesn't have any direct control over exactly what people think, and spoilers, is ultimately defeated because Merlin convinces all of the people of Camelot to ultimately turn away from the pagan idea and the idea of Mab specifically. She is ultimately defeated and destroyed because the people just stop caring about her, just forget about her, which removes all of her power and removes her from existence. So again, magic is kind of being used to operate on this logical, rational level insofar as like gods and magic and things can be that way without people's belief, without people's buy-in to these magical beings cease to exist. So the magic operates on a logic and on a rationale that's at least consistent within the narrative. It doesn't necessarily make sense from reality, but based upon the rules that we have set aside for this miniseries and for the story that's being told, the rules follow a through line, which is important in all fiction, but especially medieval or science fiction or fantasy, is that it doesn't have to necessarily make sense. It just has to be internally consistent. And again, I think that's another theme of how magic worked for me growing up and seeing all these different things in fiction, is that there was an internal consistency when it came to magic, and that really built a foundation for me on magic being this logical, rationale extension of essentially science. Essentially, it's an alternative science. It's not an alternative to science. It's just another branch of science within this universe where things operate on a logical and rational level, and they don't defy reality. They enhance the reality presented in the storytelling and in the particular universe that the story is being told. And now a little bit of a departure from what we've been talking about as far as magic being this internally consistent logical concept is a video game that was incredibly important in my childhood. And really when I was a little bit older, I would say like early teens, but that's my favorite video game of all time, Vagrant Story. From the year 2000, released for the PlayStation 1, a game that very, very few people I've played, or at least few people that I interact with have played. Fantastic game with this great gothic medieval setting, has all of these themes of dark magic and the occult and these kind of deep adult ideas about the religious figures of the church are seeking immortality, and so they are sending their own crusading knights into this city in order to track down this cult, not to destroy the cult and what they're trying to do, but in order to overtake the cult and gain this dark power that's inside of this city, this dark power that the church wants to use for its own means. And a big theme in this game is that the magic in this universe, the magic in this city, the city of Le Monde, which is based upon the idea that magic comes from grimoires, these tomes, these books that contain all this information. But the rumor is that there is a grand grimoire, this tome of immense power, so immense that immortality can actually be achieved. And all of the characters in the universe, or at least all the characters who end up being the bad guys, are after this power. There's this duke who is part of Parliament, but he's kind of gone against the grain, and the Parliament of this universe is kind of worried about him. Then there's this mysterious cult who's supposedly after this power. Then there's the church who wants to bring down the cult so they can get the power for themselves. There's a lot of political overplay going on. And this game was highly influential to me on multiple axes, not just with magic, but on my love of dark gothic fantasy, and also my love of political intrigue and backstabbing, and really kind of led me down the path that would ultimately make me love things like A Song of Ice and Fire and the adaptation Game of Thrones television series, and things that kind of go along with this theme, things that have a heavy political ideology, political intrigue, where we have multiple characters who all have their own ideals and what they want to accomplish. And nobody's necessarily a good guy, nobody's necessarily a bad guy, but we have three-dimensional characters who, from their perspective and from their point of view, all have something that they're trying to accomplish. They don't think they're the bad guy. They don't think they're evil. They're doing what they need to do in order to accomplish their goals, to accomplish what they believe is ultimately correct, is ultimately right. So in Vagrant Story, magic is kind of this, again, it's this dark, kind of anti-religious or very occult, anti-Christian, I guess, concept. The idea that all of these dark powers produce these magical spells. And now we are talking about things like fireballs and lightning bolts, but also things like curses to make people weak, to make people decrepit, to bring back the dead, bring people back from life, which in a lot of fiction, necromancy is used as kind of this illegal branch of magic. This is very, very prevalent in the Elder Scrolls game series, where necromancy is generally outlawed because it's seen as this abomination to bring the dead back to life. That's a very core concept in a lot of fictional universes involving magic and involving mages and wizards, and the moral implications that come with bringing the dead back to life. Kind of going back to our episode on character deaths and how bringing people back from the dead not only is a moral quandary in a lot of fiction, but is also a particularly hard point from a storytelling perspective, where if you're bringing characters back to life, how is the death of those characters significant? How is it dramatic if a huge source of dramatic tension, a la a character's death, can be removed from the table? In Vagrant Story, the magic is used, again, as kind of like this dark occult concept. And it's great because as you go through the game, the main character, whose name is Ashley Riot, ends up discovering that the cult is not necessarily who they seem, and their intentions aren't necessarily as bad as everyone thinks, and the church's intentions aren't necessarily as good as everyone thinks. And again, spoilers, the cardinal turns out to be after the power to gain immortality, to gain all of this dark power, this dark magic. Very reminiscent of like Final Fantasy Tactics, another game. Those two games are kind of famously known for possibly taking place in the same universe, depending on the exact video game magazine and interview you read with the director and the storytellers. So dark magic in this case is being used, but it's not necessarily about pure evil. It's about dabbling in dangerous experiments, these dangerous experiments that produce these magical effects that alter reality or that change things, give people immortality, but ultimately corrupt those who aren't powerful enough to use them. There's a big concept in the game called the blood sin, which is a tattoo that's on the back of who starts out as the main villain of the story, but Ashley discovers that the blood sin is the key to the Grand Grimoire, which actually ends up being this giant cathedral inside of the city. So the entire cathedral is the Grand Grimoire. It's not a book, it's not a tome. It's this center, this kind of mecca of dark energy and dark power. And it's revealed that the Duke, who I mentioned earlier, and the leader of the occult, Sydney, are actually related to each other, father and son. And their whole goal is to pass on this blood sin, this key, to someone who will use it for non-nefarious purposes, who ultimately ends up being Ashley, the main character of the game. But the game goes through these great pains to kind of reveal the motivations and the intentions of everyone involved, and how this dark power can be used to corrupt people and to turn people against their friends, against their lovers, against the people that they hold dear. And so the magic is almost used as this kind of MacGuffin to show how absolute power corrupts absolutely. This grand dark magic, this great source of power ultimately corrupts people, ultimately brings people to their downfall, including a bastion of the church, including this avatar, this champion, who is actually named Romeo Guildenstern. He is ultimately the one who is corrupted beyond all repair. He actually ends up betraying the cardinal, the man who he's working for in the church, the organization that he's doing everything for. He betrays them to gain the power for himself. So again, magic is kind of used in this sense as a MacGuffin in order to tell this dark gothic story about betrayal, about loss, about self-sacrifice, in that Ashley ultimately has to take the key, the tattoo, the blood sin onto himself to prevent magic, to prevent this dark power from falling into the hands of anyone else that would seek it. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit really specifically. The Hobbit was a book that I read many, many, many times as a child, and it was absolutely fascinating to me. I was kind of steeped in Tolkien and Tolkien-esque fantasy and Tolkien-esque literature at that time, and The Hobbit really, really spoke to me, as did Lord of the Rings. And something that wasn't super obvious to me at the time, but has really become clear over the years, is that when you look at it, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are a very low magic fantasy, very low level magic. In The Hobbit, you basically just have the ring that turns Bilbo invisible. And there's a few things here or there, dancing lights in the woods when they go into Mirkwood, and you could ultimately say, that's possibly the Mirkwood elves, but maybe it's not. There's a few things here and there that you could classify as magic. Bjorn shape-shifting is another one that comes to mind. Very low level magic fantasy. Ultimately, it's about this character who goes through a journey, kind of goes from their safe hobbit hole in the Shire and goes out into the world to experience adventure, to experience danger for the very first time. That was hugely inspirational to me. Not only is that book great for kids, but it's funny, and it really bestows this sense of adventure. And it's got a lot of detail, obviously, about the environments, because Tolkien was a huge fan of description. But if you can get past that, you're right down to the poems, and you have a man who created his own language in Elvish in order to build this world. We've talked before about world building and the way that Lord of the Rings really kind of grounds everything into this reality down to the language. And I'm not a huge fan of the Silmarillion. I think that book goes a little too far in trying to define every real aspect, especially when it goes into the history of the gods and the religion. And I think that really kind of takes away from the mythos and the mystery and the mysticism that's really built into those first four Tolkien novels when it comes to the main universe of Middle-earth. And the same thing when it comes to Lord of the Rings. Essentially, the most prevalent form of magic that we have, again, besides the One Ring, is the powers of Sauron and the powers of Gandalf and the other wizards. And really, the wizards in this universe are essentially just angels that are sent down to kind of guard the realms of men, dwarves, and elves, and all of the other creatures upon Middle-earth. But Gandalf and Saruman use very little magic in the novels. They use a little bit more in the films, because there are things in the films that happen that we get to explicitly see that we don't get to explicitly read in the book. We're more just filled in on the information later. And kind of going back to the same idea with the Necromancer in The Hobbit, where the movies kind of filled in that backstory a little bit more with the Necromancer coming to power. But ultimately, very low-level magic in Tolkien's original novels, and I think that was also hugely influential to me, developing an appreciation of something like A Song of Ice and Fire, where the magic is very low, and really just appreciating medieval fiction when it involves little to no magic, but still tells an intriguing medieval fantasy story. We just don't get very many of those. They're usually kind of beset by magic. And I think Tolkien set a standard for me to really appreciate low-level magic fantasy. And finally, I'm going to talk about a video game that I played a lot when I was a little kid. I actually played it a lot with my dad, which I think was hugely influential on me at the time. Again, getting to spend time with my father, who I super looked up to when I was a kid, and still do to this very day. I want to talk about the video game Myst. And Myst is something that you may or may not be familiar with, but back in the 90s, Myst was the best-selling PC game of all time. That is until The Sims came out to kind of take it over. But Myst was essentially a puzzle game. It was a game at the time had phenomenal graphics. The game was kind of developed as almost like a PowerPoint presentation that you kind of click through on certain parts of the screen. It was a point and click adventure. It's one of the kind of original big point and click adventures as far as direct puzzle solving, if you don't include things like Sierra games like King's Quest or LucasArts games, that sort of thing. But it was this graphically phenomenal game because everything was pre-rendered. All of the screens were pre-rendered, and they essentially just drew these little boxes on where you could click kind of behind the scenes, and that would lead you to the next screen, which in itself was just another pre-rendered image. And the great thing about Myst when it comes to magic, and Myst doesn't really involve magic in the traditional sense, but I think you'll get where I'm going here in a minute. The world of Myst is made up of these different ages, these different worlds, these different universes that you can travel to, and you reach these different ages through what are called linking books. Linking books are books that are specifically written in kind of a magical way, but the process isn't really detailed so much in the actual game itself. More, it's expanded on in kind of the supplemental novels that came out in the years afterwards. But essentially, these linking books are books that are written with such great detail that they actually create another world or create an age, or as we come to find out later in the series, actually just link to an existing world, link to an existing age. And this concept that a book in universe can be written that will create or link you to a whole nother world. I mean, this is very like never-ending story. And again, another kind of influential idea upon me when I was getting into fantasy and getting into magic. The idea that a book could actually be a gateway into another world. I mean, what a fantastic metaphor. Like kids read and they get to participate in stories and they get to learn about these other worlds that they don't live in, but they can experience what the characters are going through and they can really feel how the story progresses. And Myst kind of took that idea and put it into a game form and expanded on it. So as you travel throughout the game, you come to these other linking books and they take you to completely different worlds. That idea that you could link to different worlds through books was incredibly influential on me, and in a way that I didn't really realize until I revisited the game recently, watching a few Let's Plays online. Shout out to the Run Button YouTube channel. Thank you so much for kind of rekindling my interest in this game and this concept. But I didn't really realize this until recently, but thinking back on it, the idea that books link you to different worlds based upon the way they are written, that's a kind of magic in and of itself. And again, going back to the idea that magic is really just an extension of science and of logic, these worlds are linked to or created by language, by the actual words and semantics, and how semantics play an importance. In Riven, the sequel to Myst, the entire plot revolves around the idea that the villain character of the game, Gen, has gone into the world of Riven thinking that he's created it. But Gen's ability to describe the world and to kind of structure the world in a way that is meaningful and in a way that makes logical sense and is consistent is responsible for the destruction of that age, for the destruction of the world of Riven, because the descriptions and the book was written in a manner that didn't give enough detail or where the details weren't consistent. And that's actually causing the destruction of the age that the book links to. Like, these concepts are just phenomenal. And I really don't know why they're not taken more advantage of in general fiction. So this idea that writing, that the spoken word, or in this case, the written word, could be responsible for linking to these different worlds or creating these different worlds was hugely influential on me, even though I didn't realize it. Again, just being an extension of the idea that magic is just another form of science, another form of knowledge. It really just is an extension of the idea inherent in logical and rational thinking, I think that concept was hugely influential on me as a person as well. Anybody who knows me knows I'm incredibly logical and incredibly rational and reasonable, or at least try to be at all times. And not to say that emotion is worthless. Obviously, I love drama and storytelling, and emotion plays a key part of that. But the idea that logic and rationale and reasoning and knowledge is itself a kind of magic is just fascinating to me. And Mist is kind of one of the seeds that planted that idea in my brain and continued to be a huge influence on me as I grew older, as I myself learned to appreciate storytelling more, became a storyteller myself. It's endlessly fascinating to me. So hopefully you enjoyed this, me kind of rambling along about magic and what magic means to me when it comes to storytelling, when it comes to fiction. Hopefully some of that made sense. Hopefully it was inspirational. Hopefully you got something out of it. All of this was kind of off the cuff, so I hope you were able to follow along and again, get some enjoyment out of this. If you did, or if you didn't, you can let us know. You can find the show on Facebook and Twitter at Pop Rant Radio. If you're not already, you can subscribe to the show on iTunes and leave a review. That really does help out the show. And as always, I'd like to thank Major for the theme songs. Thank you, sir. And other than that, that's the show for this week. Again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next week. Bye.
It's a kind of magic.